September 3rd, 1928. London's summer had given way to the cool whisper of early autumn. In the basement laboratory of St. Mary's Hospital, Paddington, a small window let in the pale morning light, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. The room smelled of agar and alcohol, of careful science and methodical work. Professor Alexander Fleming climbed the worn stone steps to his laboratory that morning, returning from a holiday in Scotland. He was a quiet man, this Fleming. Methodical, patient, the kind of scientist who noticed things others missed, who saw patterns in chaos, who understood that nature often whispered her secrets rather than shouting them. His laboratory was modest, cluttered with the tools of a bacteriologist's trade. Glass petri dishes stacked in towers, Bunsen burners with their patient blue flames, microscopes that revealed worlds invisible to the naked eye. And everywhere, the smell of growing cultures, of bacteria blooming in their nutrient beds, tiny civilizations flourishing under glass. Before his holiday, Fleming had been working with Staphylococcus bacteria, golden yellow colonies that could cause infection, fever, sometimes death. He had prepared dozens of culture plates, inoculating them with the bacteria, watching them grow. Standard work for a bacteriologist in 1928, routine, expected. But Fleming had left some of these dishes on his laboratory bench when he departed for Scotland, uncovered, exposed to the London air that drifted through his open window. It was the kind of small oversight that happened in busy laboratories, the kind of thing that usually meant nothing at all. Except this time, it meant everything. As Fleming began sorting through his old culture plates that September morning, preparing to clean them and start fresh, he paused. One dish caught his attention. Something about it wasn't quite right. Where there should have been a uniform golden carpet of Staphylococcus, there was instead a curious pattern. A contamination, certainly. A blue-green mold had invaded the plate, probably blown in through that open window on some vagrant breeze. But it was what surrounded the mold that made Fleming stop, made him lean closer, made him forget about cleaning up and discarding the ruined plate. Around the mold colony, in a clear halo, the bacteria had simply disappeared. Where dense bacterial growth should have been, there was only clear agar, empty space, absence. Another scientist might have tutted at the contamination and thrown the plate away. Contamination was common, frustrating, the enemy of clean experimental results. But Fleming possessed something rare among scientists, curiosity married to patience. He looked at that strange halo and wondered, why had the bacteria failed to grow near the mold? What was happening in that small circle of clearing? Fleming set the dish aside carefully. He would not discard it, not yet. There was something here worth understanding. The mold, he would later identify, was Penicillium notatum, a common fungus that grows on bread and fruit, that fills autumn air with invisible spores, that humanity had lived alongside for millennia without understanding its secret. In the days that followed, Fleming cultivated the mold, growing it in broth, testing the liquid it produced. He called this mysterious substance mold juice at first, a humble name for something that would reshape human history. He found that even when diluted 800 times, this substance could still inhibit bacterial growth. He tested it against various bacteria, Streptococcus, Staphylococcus, the pathogens that caused so much human suffering. The mold juice stopped them all, yet it had no effect on human cells, no toxicity to tissues. It was improbably precisely what medicine had been seeking for decades, a substance that could kill bacteria without harming the patient. Fleming named it penicillin after the mold that produced it. He published his findings in 1929 in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology. The paper was titled, with characteristic understatement, on the antibacterial action of cultures of a penicillium. But here is where the story takes a quieter turn. One that reminds us that discovery and implementation are different things, separated sometimes by years, by resources, by the simple difficulty of turning potential into practice. Fleming's penicillin was unstable, difficult to produce in quantity. He lacked the resources and expertise to purify it, to transform it from a laboratory curiosity into a medicine that could be manufactured and administered. He continued his other work, mentioning penicillin in lectures, but unable to unlock its full potential alone. The world, meanwhile, continued turning. The 1930s passed, Europe drifted toward war, and penicillin remained a footnote, a promising observation waiting for someone to see its true significance. That someone, or rather those someones, arrived in Oxford in 1939. Howard Florey, an Australian pathologist, and Ernst Boris Chain, a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany, read Fleming's paper with fresh eyes. They saw what Fleming had seen, potential. But they brought what Fleming had lacked, the chemistry expertise and resources to extract, purify, and test penicillin systematically. With war breaking out across Europe, the timing was urgent. Soldiers were dying not only from wounds but from the infections that followed. Pneumonia, sepsis, gangrene, these invisible killers claimed as many lives as bullets and bombs. Florey and Chain worked through 1940, developing methods to extract and purify penicillin from the temperamental mold. They tested it on mice infected with streptococcus. 8 mice received penicillin, 8 did not. The next morning, the untreated mice were dead. The treated mice were alive, healthy, scurrying about their cages as if nothing had happened. The first human trial came in February 1941. A policeman named Albert Alexander, dying of a massive infection that had started with a scratch from a rose thorn. His face was covered in abscesses, his lungs filling with fluid. He was 43 years old, a husband and father, slipping away despite everything conventional medicine could do. They gave him penicillin, this experimental substance extracted with difficulty from mold cultures. Within 24 hours, his fever dropped, the abscesses began to heal. He was eating, talking, returning from the edge of death. But they ran out of penicillin. The team had only managed to produce a small amount, and Alexander's infection was massive. Without continued treatment, the bacteria returned. 5 days after his remarkable recovery began, Albert Alexander died. His death was heartbreaking, but it proved something crucial. Penicillin worked in humans, dramatically, if only they could produce enough of it. The challenge of mass production seemed insurmountable at first. Penicillium mold grew slowly, produced the antibiotic in tiny quantities. The Oxford team was cultivating it in bedpans, pie dishes, whatever containers they could find. It was medieval alchemy in a modern laboratory. But the British pharmaceutical industry, strained by war, couldn't scale up production. So Florey and Chain turned to America. In 1941, they crossed the Atlantic, carrying with them freeze-dried cultures of Penicillium notatum and the knowledge of what it could do. American pharmaceutical companies, with their vast resources and industrial capacity, saw the potential immediately. They experimented with different penicillium strains. They developed deep tank fermentation methods, allowing the mold to grow in huge quantities. They found that adding corn steep liquor, a byproduct of corn processing, dramatically increased penicillin production. By 1943, American factories were producing penicillin in quantities that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. By D-Day in June 1944, there was enough penicillin to treat every Allied soldier who needed it. Infections that would have meant death or amputation now meant recovery. The survival rate for battlefield wounds increased dramatically. The soldiers noticed. They called penicillin the wonder drug, the miracle medicine. Letters home spoke of men who should have died but didn't, who walked away from injuries that would have crippled them in previous wars. Fleming, meanwhile, had continued his work at St. Mary's Hospital, watching from a distance as others transformed his discovery into a world-changing medicine. He never claimed more credit than was due, never complained that others had received recognition for the production work he couldn't complete himself. In 1945, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded jointly to Fleming, Florey, and Chain, 3 men whose work, separated by time and circumstance, had combined to create something greater than any of them could have achieved alone. Fleming gave lectures about the discovery. He spoke of that September morning in 1928, of the contaminated culture plate, of the accident that wasn't quite an accident. Because, he reminded his audiences, chance favors the prepared mind. The mold spore that landed on his culture dish had probably landed on hundreds of others throughout history. But it took someone who was looking, someone who was curious, someone who understood bacteria well enough to recognize when something unusual had occurred. The impact of penicillin rippled outward in ways both obvious and subtle. Bacterial infections that had been death sentences became treatable nuisances. Childbirth became safer as puerperal fever could be cured. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, syphilis, all fell before antibiotics. Surgery became safer because post-operative infections could be prevented or treated. Life expectancy began to climb. The antibiotics era, beginning with penicillin, added years to human lifespans. Some estimate that antibiotics have saved more than 200 million lives since their introduction. 200 million people who would have died, but didn't. But Fleming, always thoughtful, always cautious, warned of something else. In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech in 1945, he spoke about resistance. He noted that bacteria could become resistant to penicillin if exposed to insufficient doses. He warned that casual use, incomplete treatments, could create bacteria that the drug could no longer touch. It was a prophetic warning, one that we're still grappling with today. But in 1945, in the immediate aftermath of a war that had killed millions, the promise of penicillin seemed almost miraculous. A weapon against invisible enemies, a gift from a humble mold. Fleming died in 1955 at the age of 73. He was buried as a national hero in St. Paul's Cathedral, an honor reserved for those whose contributions to humanity transcend ordinary achievement. The quiet Scottish bacteriologist who noticed a contaminated culture plate had become one of the most celebrated scientists of the 20th century. But perhaps his greatest legacy isn't the fame or the recognition. It's simpler than that. It's in every person who survived an infection that would have killed them in an earlier age. Every child who lived past diseases that once claimed half of all children before their 5th birthday. Every surgery performed safely, every wound that healed without complication. The story of penicillin reminds us that great discoveries often begin quietly. Not with dramatic breakthroughs in gleaming laboratories, but with small observations. A contaminated culture plate, a curious mind, a willingness to look closely at what others might have discarded. It reminds us, too, that discovery is rarely the work of one person alone. Fleming saw the potential, but Florian Chain made it real. American industry made it available. Countless doctors administered it. Millions of patients benefited from it. It was collaboration across borders, across disciplines, across years. And it all began with an uncovered petri dish on a September morning in London when a Scottish bacteriologist noticed that something unexpected had happened, and instead of cleaning it away, he leaned closer and wondered why. Tonight, as you settle into rest, consider that forgotten dish. Consider the millions of lives that stemmed from one moment of careful attention, from one scientist's curiosity about why bacteria wouldn't grow near a patch of blue-green mold. Consider how often the world changes not with thunder and lightning, but with quiet observation, with someone noticing something small and thinking it worth understanding. Fleming's laboratory is long gone. St. Mary's Hospital has been modernized many times over, but somewhere in a museum, preserved under glass, is that original culture plate. The one with the Penicillin mold, the one with the clear halo where bacteria should have been. It sits there quietly, this small circle of glass and agar, this humble thing that changed the world. A reminder that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with what we plan, but with what we notice. Not with what we expect, but with what surprises us. Rest now. Tomorrow, antibiotics will continue their quiet work, saving lives without fanfare, without announcement. Just as penicillin has done every day since that forgotten culture plate revealed its secret. Small things, careful attention, curious minds. Sometimes that's all it takes to change the world.